I grew up just outside a very small town in a very old farmhouse. It had an upstairs, but it was more like an attic when we moved in. My dad updated the house little by little over the course of the 15 plus years we lived there, the first being the upstairs. To give you an idea of the upstairs area, about 3 feet of the ceiling running down both sides of the room was slanted as it was actually the roof. The remaining ceiling was flat, the walls being only about 4.5-ish feet tall, but the rest of the room was regular height with windows at each end. That means there had to be a space above the flat part of the ceiling and the point of the roof. He split the room in half by building a wall. My brother had the first half where the stairs were and I had the second half. You had to actually walk through my parents' room to get to the stairway, then through my brother's room to get to mine. I may have over-explained that, but the point is that there was an inaccessible crawl space above my room. I lived in this house from the time I was a baby until I graduated high school. Except for a few creepy feelings and explained away noises, I never felt uncomfortable there. It was a very acceptable place to grow up, until I saw the face in my ceiling. I had insomnia growing up, so I spent my nights in bed either reading or just staring out the windows at the sky. This particular night I was just laying there in the dark, the only light in the room coming from the moonlight through the windows. It was then I noticed a spot on my ceiling about the size of a basketball that was slightly brighter than the rest of the darkness. I was sleepless and bored, so I spent a few minutes just staring at it and thinking how I had never noticed that certain reflection of moonlight before. I had a dresser with a big mirror on it, so I assumed it was a reflection from that since it was the opposite of the windows and the spot was towards the center of my ceiling. I'm really not sure what made me decide to investigate further. Boredom, most likely. I get out of bed and proceed to wave my hand around in front of the mirror and every surface I thought might be reflecting the moonlight. Nothing. The slightly brighter spot on my ceiling remained unchanged. I shut my blinds. It was still there. I drew the curtains. Nope. So, leaving the curtains closed, I laid back down in the now totally dark room. I continued to stare at it when I realized I can just make out a face. Slightly dimmer areas made out the eyes, nose, and mouth. It was right then. I was overcome with the feeling of complete terror. My fight or flight took over and I was off the bed, through my door, and down the stairs in an instant. I never felt my feet hit the floor, even to open my door. This is where my memory of that night ends. Over the years, I still think about it. It was as if there was a ghost, for lack of a better word, laying on the floor of that crawl space and sticking its head through my ceiling. I never slept in that room again. I switched rooms with my parents. In fact, I went into that room only a handful of times before I moved out a year or two later. When I was a kid, my grandmother had this old house in Texas. I hated that house. Even as a kid, I could sense something was bad in it and I refused to be left alone. I especially hated the pink room and preferred to sleep in a different room every time I went to visit. Anyways, one time I came to visit my grandmother and I was told the room I usually stay in was unavailable, I guess because of renovations. I had to sleep on the floor in the pink room while my parents slept in the bed. I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong and I felt like I was being watched. As I laid on the ground, I suddenly saw 2 black hooded figures standing at the front of my parents' bed. They had their arms crossed and their heads were covered with a cloak hanging low. They stood there, not moving and not making a sound. I was scared stiff. I remember rubbing my eyes thinking I was dreaming or just seeing things, but they were still there. Eventually I mustered up enough courage to stand up to get to my parents. As I was walking to get to my mom, they disappeared. I got to my mom and woke her up. She asked me what did I want and I just bluntly told her that I think I was seeing a ghost. Still very tired, she told me to go back to bed and just pray, so I did. I went back to my floor and as I sat down, they reappeared in front of me. I prayed. They stayed with me the whole night. Years and years later, my brother had went to visit my grandma and told me he slept in the same pink room. I asked him how was his stay, and he told me he saw a black hooded figure move in the room at night. My brother isn't one to lie, so hearing him say this made me think I wasn't so crazy after all. In the year 2000, my family and I moved into a brand new house that we had built. It was in a new part of a subdivision. We literally were the only house back there for some time. These events happened randomly over a period of a few years from 2002 to 2005. The first thing I remember happening was I was laying in bed one night. The house had an open concept with 20 feet of cathedral ceilings, meaning you could literally hear everything downstairs. We had hardwood floors put in over our foyer a couple of years after moving in, so whenever somebody walked through there, you could hear the wood creak. I was laying in my bed when I heard footsteps walk across the hardwood floor. I figured it was my dad, who would normally get up and grab a glass of water or something. He walked kind of heavy, and the footsteps sounded just like that. The footsteps continued on through what would be the dining room and into the kitchen. But they didn't stop. They kept on coming into the living room and started up the stairs. The footsteps then walked past my door and into our bonus room, which was over the garage, and then suddenly stopped. They never exited. I was spooked, but then just kind of let it go and fell asleep. The next day I asked my dad what he was doing upstairs last night. He told me he never got up. I was totally confused. Who was walking around the house in the middle of the night? Strange things started happening from that point. I always slept with the door shut, and sometimes it would literally open by itself. The knob would turn and the door would swing wide open. Another time I was on the verge of falling asleep when a deep voice would say, "Hey," and I shot up expecting to see my dad, but there was nobody there. My dad would frequently smell the perfume of an old girlfriend he had in high school who committed suicide sometimes in the 80s. He would swear my mother never wore that scent, and he would always say it was her. Another time he was on a chair watching TV when he said a woman in 19th period clothing walked out from my brother's bedroom and into mine. The final thing that happened was when I was a junior in high school. I was on my way home from basketball practice. My friend's dad was a coach and was giving me a ride home. As we were coming down the street, we all saw a large man walk down off of my front porch and around to the back of my house. My friend's dad, who was pretty tall and strong, said, "Was that your dad?" To which I replied, "No." After pulling in my driveway, he told us to stay in the car. By that time, my dad had walked out, and they both went around to the back of my house and came back around a few minutes later. They both found nothing, and my dad kept saying that somebody kept knocking on the front door, but when he would answer, there would be nobody there. Always 3 knocks. After that, nothing happened ever again. We ended up moving out in 2007. When I was a sophomore in high school, I was on the phone late one night with my then girlfriend. It was probably around 2 a.m. and I was trying to fall asleep on the phone when all of a sudden I heard this loud tap on my window. It sounded like someone was throwing a rock at my window trying to get my attention or something. I ignored it, thinking it was just my window cracking from it being so hot during the day, and the cool night air was making it do that. About 5 minutes later it happened again. This time my girlfriend heard it too and asked what that noise was. I told her I didn't know and that it was the second time that it had happened. I got up to take a look. My window was on the second floor of the house and also on the side of the house. We lived in a subdivision, so I figured it could be my best friend Chris trying to get my attention, even though I couldn't figure out why he would be doing this late at night. Usually my parents would turn on the coach lights next to the garage door so the light would illuminate off my neighbor's house, but on this night they didn't. So it was very dark out apart from a full moon giving off that eerie bit of light. When I peered out the window, I saw a tall man standing in my yard, peering right up at me. I froze. My girlfriend was asking me what was going on. I told her there was a man down there and he was just standing right there. I told her I would call her back and ran down my parents' room. I woke up my dad and told him what happened. He got up and went outside. He came back a few minutes later and said nobody was out there. He then called the police and they came out and did a quick walk around, but didn't find anything. I went back to my room, called my girlfriend and told her what happened. I then hung up and went to bed. About a week later, around the same time, I was laying in bed when it happened again. 2 loud thumps at my window. This time the coach lights were on, so it wasn't so dark out. I looked out the window to see a large shadow reflecting off my neighbor's house, meaning whoever it was had walked around the front of my house. Again, I woke up my dad. He called the police, and nothing came of it. It never happened again after that. I am an avid mountain walker and spend most weekends trekking the mountains and hills of South Wales. I've done this for over 15 years. Within that time, only twice have I ever felt genuinely concerned for my safety. Once when I was confronted by a bull, and the other in this story. It was a boiling hot Saturday afternoon about 5 years ago. I was doing one of my favorite walks, which was about 14 miles long. This particular area was mainly forestry, but the tracks themselves were gravel. There were no other walkers and only a few cyclists, which was kind of typical with it being so hot. So the first 9 to 10 miles were standard. I was at the bottom of a track that would eventually lead to the top of the valley. About 15 meters ahead I could see a man walking in the same direction. He was tall, thin, and had short cropped hair. He was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and black boots, and he walked with a strange limp, and it looked like he had to swing his leg around, almost like one leg was shorter than the other. I didn't think much of it. He was actually walking quite fast, so I probably wouldn't have to overtake him. I carried on up the track. The sun was overhead and it was sweltering. The man in front kept limping along, but nonetheless was making quick work of the incline. The track started to bend and I lost sight of the limping man. The track comes to a choice of 2 paths, east that leads to a small car park that is rarely used, and west which leads to the top of the valley. As I was about to head west, I heard a man shout. It was coming from within the forest. I waited a second, and then another outburst. My first thought was that guy must have tried taking a shortcut and had fallen over. As I made my way through the thick trees and ferns to see what was up, I stopped dead in my boots. Up ahead through the trees I could see the man. He was sat down on a log with his head in his hands. He then screamed at the top of his lungs. He then bolted up and started punching a tree. His face was bright red, he was raging. He then picked up a stick and started to bash it against the tree. I was frozen. I couldn't actually process what the hell was going on. He just looked absolutely mad. He shouted,
"I hate you!"
and started stomping his feet. I simply thought I needed to get out of here before he sees me. I quietly started to make my way back to the track, careful not to fall over to make any loud noises. That man was clearly a lunatic. I thought I would go the more rarely used east track and then take a shortcut north through the ferns. This was probably the best way to avoid him. With every step I became more confident and almost started to laugh about it. Maybe he wanted to let off a bit of steam and vent some anger. The middle of a forest seems like the perfect place, I suppose. So after about 10 to 15 minutes the ferns started to grow thick and they were at chest level. It wasn't a problem because they are fairly easy to push through. As I looked back behind me, I could see the limping man about 25 meters away. He is wading through the ferns towards me. He had a strange snarl on his face and his head is bobbing up and down between the ferns. I couldn't believe what was happening. He must have seen me. There was no other explanation. I was only a mile away from a main road, so I started to speed up and walk a bit faster. I occasionally looked behind me and could see I was getting further and further away. I started to relax. It's over. I still don't know what to make of the situation, but the fact he followed me through the ferns was the most disturbing thing. I have done that same walk over a dozen times since and haven't seen him again.